Amerasians was because I was working with a girl who was a Vietnamese Amerasian. And when we would have our holiday events, she would always bring food that was very detailed, little round rosettes full of goodies inside. And because the food she brought in the preparation, I could see that it was labor intensive, I became really interested in her culture. And as a consequence, I started doing research about Vietnamese Amerasians. I'd like to also add that she had been discriminated against when she applied for hire at the post office because everybody's name goes on a list. And because she was Asian, they had bypassed her on the hiring worksheet. She had had to file a EEO charging discrimination, and as a consequence, she was eventually hired. And over a period of years, they finally put her seniority date where it should have been. All of that is what caused me to become interested in Vietnamese Amerasians. The U.S. involvement in Vietnam began in 1954 with military advisors. Then in 1960, the first boots on the ground appeared in the country. A highly visible sex industry developed. Anywhere you got a lot of soldiers, you're going to have a lot of sex trafficking going on. Many common law marriages took place between servicemen, government workers, and local natives throughout the country. They didn't always have certificates of marriage. They didn't always have birth certificates, and as a consequence, these children often, who were born of these unions, could not provide documentation of their heritage and their parentage. As a result, numbers of mixed-race children appeared, and many of these children would end up displaced because the Vietnamese refused to offer them inclusion for many reasons. The most prevalent reason was because many of the children had visible physical attributes that revealed their blended heritage. Some had come from European, Australian, English, Australian Aboriginal, who are dark like me, and American heritage. Skin and hair color readily identified them to be of mixed heritage. The children with African American, Native American, and Hispanic Latino, and Australian Aboriginal features were the hardest hit with discriminatory practices. These children had the darkest complexion and distinctive facial features that would identify that they did not possess pure Vietnamese heritage. Because of their darker skin, they were relegated to life on the streets. They formed group gangs as their families, and they had to beg for food daily. Many of them were sexually assaulted or forced at pre-adolescent ages to enter prostitution, male and female. Lost between two cultures, Vietnamese natives with dual ethnicity would ultimately suffer emotional, physical, and psychological harm. In this hostile environment, thousands who had tried to escape died in the process. Then there were those who had been exposed to Agent Orange, a part of the chemical arsenal of the U.S. combat strategy. This chemical herbicide had been used as part of the war effort and has been documented after the war to have caused cancer and severe birth defects of anyone who had been exposed. Currently, the Department of Veteran Affairs provides compensation to the children of American female veterans who had served in Vietnam. Cleft palate, congenital heart disease, club foot, hip dysplasia, and neural tube defects are just a few medical conditions for which compensatory medical care is now provided. The American Public Health Association's policy resolution that was passed in 2007 recommended providing medical, nursing, durable equipment, and community support to care for American and Vietnamese people who have been harmed by Agent Orange. Areas in Vietnam where the carcinogen dioxin, known as Agent Orange, still registers unacceptably high levels of contamination. Even today. At the end of the war, there were 3 waves of the Vietnam diaspora in which these people began coming to the United States. In 1982, the Amerasian Immigration Act offered top priority immigration to children fathered by American servicemen in Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand. This covered only the children of American servicemen. Then in 1987, after the passage of the American Homecoming Act, children of American servicemen, Vietnamese women, and their close relative would be permitted to come to the United States. As a result, a large group of immigrants from Vietnam would become known as Amerasians. Children who had no family would pay someone to identify as their parent refugee and to accompany them on their journey to the United States resettlement camps. After arriving, this person would often abandon them. The money for this would have come through prostitution or some other horrific means to cover their enrollment as a refugee. The status of refugee would allow them to be entitled to food, housing, clothing, employment services, and follow-up medical care for up to 8 months. This could go on for up to 7 years after their arrival. After 7 years, the benefits would stop unless they acquired U.S. citizenship. They would be entitled to civil rights protections, but could not work for the federal government unless it was with the U.S. Armed Forces. Immigration status did not provide this particular benefit level. However, resettlement camps offered, despite the benefits, deplorable living conditions. Children, girls, and boys were raped. Life in a resettlement camp was not much different than the streets of Vietnam. Still, this was more than they would have gotten as Vietnamese Amerasians in Vietnam. These Amerasian children were discriminated against because of their mixed race heritage. Having no access to the extended family of their mothers, ostracism and poverty were conditions that put them at risk as a population group, whether here or in Vietnam. Many had been tossed out by their own mothers to fend for themselves. In coming to the United States, they were still unwanted. Besides having to deal with finding work, learning English, and adapting to a totally different culture, they now had to learn how to assimilate with the liabilities of skin color, hair color, and texture, and at times a disability resulting from residues of Agent Orange. Identity struggles that Afro-Amerasians experienced were congruent with African American cultured experiences in our country. The suffering was still the same. They had been called outcasts, half-bloods, and children of the dust in Vietnam. Here in the United States, some who were white enough, without the attributes that might reveal their heritage, they would benefit from white privilege in work and social settings. Then others of mixed heritage could pass for pure Vietnamese in our country. The basic philosophy of these people can be found in Taoist epistemology, observing human suffering as a part of life. Buddhism, although the prevalent religion of Vietnamese people, Confucian ethics and doctrine were tenets they also embraced. In their culture, the father was leader, breadwinner, and decision maker. Family had been the most important part, with parents first, then siblings, and finally extended family being represented. Folklore, myths, and songs were passed from one generation to another. Harmony and balance of life through these teachings and rituals have been denied these Amerasians. They have been uprooted from all traces of family, of their roots, traditions, and socialization experiences. Their holidays, religious ceremonies, ethnic foods, and celebratory banquets that would have helped them to identify in recovery, they have been denied these Amerasians once arriving on American soil. In the court systems in America, cultural issues involving Amerasian languages often counted against these Vietnamese Amerasians. Even with an interpreter, dialects were often misunderstood. Encounters between them and law enforcement have been framed unfairly by language discrepancies as they related to Miranda rights through their interpreters. Crimes of domestic violence had sentencing without any consideration being given for cultural significance. Also, there have been prosecutions in which child abuse relative to Western culture may have been defined in Vietnamese culture as discipline. Sentencing native-born litigants and foreign-born litigants in criminal cases identify conflicting approaches. Without exception, foreign-born litigants have been handled unfairly. Assimilation and acculturation through marriage into the acceptable Vietnamese community here in the United States has changed things somewhat for those Amerasians. There are also many who have married Anglo-American partners and have embraced that dominant culture here. They have had the freedom to be able to redefine the elements of the culture they wanted to keep. In comparing second-generation Amerasians to blacks with years of schooling, assessment figures about education identify that Vietnamese Amerasians have less poverty, better wages, and more opportunities for managerial and professional employment. Food and mealtime represent harmony of culture in that men eat first. On their holiday, there's a special meal of rice leaves made with rice stuffed with green beans and fatty pork. These are wrapped in bamboo leaves to boil overnight. There also may be ancestor worship. There may be herbal messages used by some Amerasians. These Amerasian women also have the highest rate of cervical cancer, possibly from the effects of Agent Orange. Medically, these people embrace acupuncture, massage, cup suctioning, skin pinching for headache, or even sore throat remedies. Not unusual for Amerasian men, after coming to the United States as refugees, they work several jobs just to maintain status as the head of family. His wife's income may be the same or more than his, and she may gain decision-maker status in the family. The Amerasian community has over 1,088 people registered on a virtual sex site, 1 bisexual and 8 gay men. There are support groups for homosexual and transgender individuals, lesbians, bisexual women, and female-to-male transgender women. This reflected a wow moment for me because besides coming to this country with this great moral turpitude they had in Vietnam, they readily embraced the morals that we have in this country and joined up with these different sex sites online. There are many foundations and groups supporting Amerasians of all ethnicities, not just the Vietnamese Amerasians. Ann Curry is an Amerasian, and she is from Japanese descent. Leslie Charteris, the author of the character of the Saint, Simon Templar, in all of his movies and books, he's Amerasian. Several actors are Amerasian or are of Amerasian descent. For example, Jennifer and Meg Tilly, Phoebe Cates, just to name 3. Efforts at reunification are viable through different registries. There's an Amerasian registry, an Amerasian child find, and VN Ware Orphans. And there's a newsletter that they publish to support these children who are trying to find their birth parents. Photos of Amerasians still living in Vietnam because they lack proof of American parentage. These newsletters and groups are working to help them with reunification. But not everybody seeks reunification with that serviceman or government worker who was their father. Many Amerasians continue to have unresolved sense of self-identity and need psychotherapy at many levels. They have learned to be distrustful as a means of survival. These therapists that they have try to help them rebuild their identity. Denied a sense of Vietnamese culture, traditions, and socialization, they have discovered that here in America, their racial differences have created a source of shame, pain, fear, and exclusion. They have lost the sense of culture, socialization, and identity. Those who can successfully navigate a merger into white privileged culture are the lucky ones. The rest are suffering almost the same fate as African Americans. Because of the color of their skin, some live in abject poverty without education, jobs, or even access to health care. Some experience community alienation, cultural conflict, and can find no acceptable place in American society. Some have PTSD, unwanted pregnancies, feelings of alienation, gang memberships, and various mental health issues. The record will show that race does indeed matter in America. They have the same basic problem that African Americans have in this land of the free and home of the brave, the inability to change the color of their skin. And then I have a friend that's a student, one of my classmates, who is Amerasian, of Vietnamese extraction. And she shared with me her story of how her mother and father handled her throughout her life till she got to be an adult. She's in her 30s now. But anyway, her father was black and her mother was Vietnamese. And because he was in the military, they moved from place to place within the United States and even overseas. She's lived in several foreign countries and she's able to speak many foreign languages. After they moved back to the United States, and even as a child, she kept getting into trouble. She was arrested for different crimes that she committed. She was on drugs. She was in the juvenile detention centers from time to time. And the thing that saved her was her grandparents. Her black grandparents in this country took custody of her, and she attributes them with having turned her life around. She joined the military, and she's retired from the military right now, and she has been a blessing to everybody in our class. She has her life intact. She's studying to be a social worker. And it just shows how if we really are caring and concerned about others, we can make a difference in people's lives. That is what her grandparents did for her, and that is what I hope this class will do for me. Thank you.
Good job, good job.
Oh, wow, that was pretty good.
Huh?